In the shadow of Windsor Castle's ancient stones, where kings and queens had walked for centuries, a different kind of royalty was about to emerge. Not born of bloodlines or crowns, but forged in sweat, determination, and the relentless pursuit of dreams that society had long told them were impossible. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the tall windows of the castle's reception hall, watching the morning mist roll across the grounds. In just hours, this very room would host something unprecedented, a gathering that would change the landscape of women's sport forever. But she didn't know that yet. None of them did. What started as a simple reception to celebrate women's achievements in sport would become the catalyst for a revolution that had been building for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right voice, and the right stage to finally break through. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, reviewed the guest list one final time. Her fingers traced down the names, each representing a story of triumph against overwhelming odds. These weren't just athletes, they were pioneers who had fought for recognition in a world that had systematically overlooked women's contributions to sport. Sarah Mitchell, the first woman to captain England's rugby team to a World Cup victory, would be arriving within the hour. Her journey from playing in muddy fields with no proper facilities to lifting the trophy at Twickenham had taken 15 years of unwavering determination. When Sarah first picked up a rugby ball at university, women's rugby was barely acknowledged as a legitimate sport. The national team trained in borrowed facilities, funded their own travel to international competitions, and juggled full-time jobs with their athletic commitments. Catherine remembered reading about Sarah's early years in the sport. The young woman had worked night shifts as a nurse to support herself while training during the day. There were times when Sarah had considered quitting, especially after a particularly brutal loss where the women's team was forced to change in the car park because the men's team was using the only proper changing room. But something inside her refused to accept that women deserved less simply because of their gender. The princess walked through the reception hall, imagining how it would look filled with these remarkable women. The room had hosted countless formal dinners and state occasions, but today would mark the first time it would celebrate the achievements of female athletes on such a scale. The idea had come to her months earlier during a visit to a local girls' football academy, where she had witnessed firsthand the stark difference in resources between male and female programs. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the pioneering sports scientist who had revolutionized training methods for female athletes, was another guest who held special significance. Elena's research had challenged decades of assumptions about women's physical capabilities. When she first proposed that women's training should be tailored to their unique physiological needs rather than simply adapting men's programs, the sports science community had dismissed her work as unnecessary. They argued that athletes were athletes, regardless of gender. But Elena persisted, conducting groundbreaking studies that proved women's bodies responded differently to various training stimuli. Her work revealed that hormonal cycles, bone density differences, and muscle fiber composition all required specific consideration in training programs. When her methods were finally implemented by forward-thinking coaches, the results were undeniable. Performance improvements in female athletes were dramatic, shattering previous records and challenging long-held beliefs about women's athletic potential. The princess had spent considerable time studying Elena's research, recognizing that supporting women's sport wasn't just about providing equal opportunities, but about understanding and embracing the unique strengths that women brought to athletics. This reception wasn't merely a ceremonial gesture, it was a platform to highlight the scientific evidence that supported investing in women's sport as a distinct and valuable endeavor. As she continued her walk through the castle, Catherine's thoughts turned to Maria Santos, the Paralympic swimmer whose story had captured international attention. Maria had lost her left arm in a car accident at age 16, just as she was being scouted by university swimming programs. The accident had ended her dreams of competing in traditional swimming events, but it had also opened a door to Paralympic competition that she never knew existed. The journey hadn't been straightforward. Paralympic sport, particularly women's Paralympic sport, received even less attention and funding than mainstream women's athletics. Maria had trained in public pools during off-peak hours, often swimming alone while maintenance workers cleaned around her. Her coach, a former Olympian named James Wright, had volunteered his time because there was no budget to pay him properly. What made Maria's story particularly compelling was how she had transformed her personal struggle into a mission to support other women with disabilities in sport. She had established a foundation that provided equipment and coaching for young women entering Paralympic sports, recognizing that the barriers they faced were often insurmountable without proper support. Maria understood that talent alone wasn't enough. These athletes needed infrastructure, funding, and visibility to succeed. The princess paused at a portrait of Queen Victoria, thinking about how different the world had been during her reign. Women of that era were discouraged from any form of vigorous physical activity, deemed too delicate for such pursuits. The transformation over the centuries was remarkable, yet Catherine knew they were still far from true equality in sport. Today's reception was both a celebration of progress and an acknowledgement of how much work remained. Among the invited guests was Jennifer Chang, a former professional tennis player who had transitioned into sports administration after retiring from competition. Jennifer's playing career had been marked by extraordinary talent but limited earning potential. Even as one of the top-ranked players in her sport, she had struggled financially, living in shared accommodations and carefully budgeting every expense while her male counterparts in similar rankings enjoyed comfortable lifestyles. After retirement, Jennifer had channeled her frustration into systemic change, working within tennis organizations to address prize money disparities and improve conditions for female players. Her efforts had resulted in significant improvements, but the process had taken years of diplomatic negotiations and careful coalition building. Jennifer understood that change in sports bureaucracy happens slowly, requiring patience and strategic thinking rather than dramatic gestures. The princess admired Jennifer's approach to advocacy, recognizing the importance of working within existing systems while pushing for reform. Today's reception represented a similar strategy, using the platform of royal support to elevate women's sport while working within traditional structures to create lasting change. Another significant guest was Dr. Amara Okafor, a sports psychologist who had dedicated her career to understanding the unique mental challenges faced by female athletes. Amara's research had revealed troubling patterns of eating disorders, anxiety, and depression among women in sport, often exacerbated by societal pressures about appearance and femininity. Her work had challenged the sports world to consider not just physical performance, but the complete well-being of female athletes. Amara had developed innovative support programs that addressed these mental health challenges while helping athletes maintain competitive excellence. Her holistic approach recognized that female athletes often face different psychological pressures than their male counterparts, including criticism about their appearance, questions about their femininity, and societal expectations about balancing athletic careers with traditional roles as wives and mothers. The princess had been particularly moved by Amara's work with young athletes, helping them develop resilience and self-confidence that extended far beyond sport. These programs had demonstrated that investing in women's sport created ripple effects throughout society, producing confident leaders who challenged gender stereotypes in all areas of life. As morning turned to afternoon, Catherine made final preparations for the reception. The guest list represented not just individual achievements, but a collective movement that was reshaping society's understanding of women's capabilities. These women had competed not just against opponents in their respective sports, but against centuries of assumption that they were somehow less capable, less entertaining, or less worthy of support than male athletes. The reception would bring together Olympic champions and community coaches, professional athletes and volunteer administrators, scientists and advocates. Each had contributed to the growing recognition that women's sport deserved investment, coverage, and celebration. Their stories would interweave throughout the afternoon, creating a tapestry that illustrated both the progress made and the potential still unrealized. Standing in the grand reception hall one final time before guests arrived, Catherine felt the weight of the moment. This gathering represented more than royal hospitality, it was a statement about values and priorities. By hosting these remarkable women in one of Britain's most prestigious venues, the royal family was signaling that women's achievements in sport deserved the highest recognition and support. The princess understood that her role extended beyond ceremony. As a public figure with global influence, her support could amplify these women's voices and accelerate progress toward genuine equality in sport. The reception was just the beginning of what she hoped would be a sustained commitment to advancing women's athletics at every level. As the first guests began to arrive, Catherine prepared to welcome them not just as a royal host, but as an ally in their ongoing mission to create a world where gender would never again determine an athlete's opportunities or recognition. The reception hall gradually filled with an energy that seemed to transform the ancient space. These women, who had spent their careers fighting for recognition and resources, now found themselves gathered in one of the most prestigious venues in the country. The initial formal atmosphere quickly evolved into something more intimate and powerful as stories began to emerge from conversations throughout the room. Sarah Mitchell stood near the ornate fireplace, sharing her experience with a group that included several younger athletes. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had fought battles that others would never have to face, thanks to her perseverance. She described the early days of women's rugby, when finding proper equipment was nearly impossible and travel budgets were non-existent. "We used to stuff newspapers in our socks because we couldn't afford proper shin guards," Sarah explained to a young footballer whose eyes widened in disbelief. "The men's team had professional-grade equipment provided by sponsors, while we searched second-hand shops for anything that might protect us during matches. But, you know what? Those experiences taught us to be resourceful and appreciate every opportunity that came our way." The young footballer, Rebecca Taylor, had received a full scholarship to university based on her athletic abilities, something that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. She listened intently as Sarah continued, describing matches where they had to provide their own refreshments and recruit their own referees. The contrast between Sarah's experiences and Rebecca's current opportunities illustrated just how much progress had been made, yet both women understood that equality remained elusive. Dr. Elena Rodriguez joined their conversation, adding a scientific perspective to the discussion. She explained how her early research had been met with skepticism from established sports scientists who couldn't understand why women's training needed to be different from men's. The medical establishment had long operated under the assumption that research conducted on male subjects could be universally applied, an approach that had significantly limited female athletic development. "When I first proposed studying menstrual cycle impacts on athletic performance, colleagues suggested I was making excuses for inferior results," Elena shared, her voice tinged with the memory of those frustrating early years. They couldn't comprehend that understanding physiological differences might actually unlock superior performance rather than explain away limitations. Elena's breakthrough had come when she convinced a small group of coaches to implement her training protocols with their female athletes. The results were immediate and dramatic. Athletes who had plateaued using traditional training methods suddenly began achieving personal bests and setting new records. The success was so pronounced that male coaches began requesting Elena's input, no longer dismissing her work as irrelevant. The conversation drew the attention of Maria Santos, who had been speaking with Catherine about adaptive training techniques for Paralympic athletes. Maria's perspective added another dimension to the discussion about recognizing and accommodating differences rather than pretending they didn't exist. "In Paralympic sport, we've always understood that different bodies require different approaches," Maria explained. "What Elena discovered about women's physiology parallels what we know about disability and athletic performance. It's not about making accommodations or excuses, it's about optimizing performance based on actual human variation rather than arbitrary standards." Maria described her own journey of adapting to competitive swimming after losing her arm. The process had required not just physical adjustment, but a complete reimagining of technique and strategy. Traditional coaching methods, designed for athletes with full mobility, had been largely irrelevant to her situation. She had worked with innovative coaches to develop new approaches that maximized her strengths rather than compensating for perceived limitations. The princess moved throughout the room, listening to these conversations and beginning to understand the complex web of challenges that these women had navigated. Each story revealed different aspects of systemic barriers that had prevented female athletes from reaching their full potential. The issues weren't just about funding or media coverage, though those remained significant problems. The challenges were deeply embedded in assumptions about women's capabilities and the purposes of sport itself. Jennifer Chang approached a group discussing the economics of professional sport, bringing her experience from tennis administration. She explained how prize money disparities had been justified for decades through circular logic that frustrated athletes and advocates. Tournament organizers argued that women's events generated less revenue, so smaller prizes were appropriate. However, this ignored the fact that limited marketing budgets and inferior scheduling had contributed to reduced audience interest. "We faced a chicken and egg problem," Jennifer explained. They said women's tennis wasn't as entertaining, but they scheduled our matches during off-peak hours and spent minimal resources promoting them. When we finally secured equal billing and marketing support, suddenly, our matches were just as popular and profitable. Jennifer's work had involved painstaking analysis of television ratings, ticket sales, and sponsorship data to build irrefutable arguments for equal treatment. She had learned to speak the language of business executives, translating athletic achievement into financial metrics they could understand. The process had been exhausting and sometimes demoralizing, but the results had created opportunities for the next generation of female players. Dr. Amara Okafor contributed insights about the psychological dimensions of these economic disparities. Her research had revealed how financial stress affected female athletes differently than their male counterparts, often forcing difficult choices between athletic careers and financial stability. Many talented women had been lost to sport simply because they couldn't afford to continue competing at elite levels. Male athletes often had more family support for extended training periods because their eventual earning potential justified the investment, Amara explained. Female athletes faced pressure to pursue practical careers because their sports offered limited financial returns. This created additional psychological burden that affected performance and career longevity. Amara's work had extended beyond individual therapy to examine institutional factors that created mental health challenges for female athletes. She had identified patterns of discrimination that were often subtle but consistently undermining. Female athletes were more likely to have their emotions scrutinized, their appearance criticized, and their commitment questioned when they experienced normal performance variations. The princess found herself particularly engaged by a conversation between several coaches who had dedicated their careers to developing young female athletes. These women understood that changing sport required starting at the grassroots level, creating environments where girls could develop confidence and skills without confronting the barriers that had limited previous generations. Coach Patricia Williams, who had developed one of the country's most successful youth athletics programs, described the careful attention required to counteract societal messages that discouraged girls from pursuing sports seriously. Her program emphasized skill development and personal achievement rather than competition against boys or unrealistic appearance standards. Girls arrive at our program having already internalized messages about what they can and cannot do, Patricia explained. Our first job isn't teaching athletic technique, it's helping them believe they have the right to take up space, make noise, and pursue excellence without apology. Patricia's methods had produced numerous scholarship recipients and professional athletes, but she was equally proud of former participants who had become confident leaders in other fields. The lessons learned through sport, particularly the ability to persist through failure and advocate for themselves, had proven valuable far beyond athletic competition. As afternoon progressed into evening, the formal reception evolved into smaller, more intimate conversations throughout the castle's public rooms. The princess moved between groups, asking thoughtful questions and listening carefully to responses. Her genuine interest in their experiences was evident, and the women responded by sharing increasingly personal and detailed accounts of their journeys. Dr. Rodriguez found herself in deep conversation with several young scientists who had been inspired by her work to pursue careers in sports medicine. They discussed current research projects and future possibilities, the conversation ranging from hormone replacement therapy for transgender athletes to altitude training adaptations in female mountaineers. The complexity and sophistication of their discussion would have surprised those who had once dismissed women's sports science as unnecessary. Maria Santos gathered with other Paralympic athletes to discuss the unique challenges they faced in gaining recognition and resources. Their conversation revealed how disability intersected with gender to create additional barriers in sport. Female Paralympic athletes often struggled for attention even within the disability sport community, where male athletes typically received more media coverage and sponsorship opportunities. People seemed to think we were inspiring just for participating, Maria explained. They couldn't see past the disability and gender to recognize that we were elite athletes pursuing excellence just like anyone else. The inspiration narrative was actually limiting because it focused on our personal stories rather than our athletic achievements. The group discussed strategies for changing this narrative, emphasizing performance and competition rather than overcoming adversity. they had worked to highlight the technical skill, strategic thinking, and physical conditioning required for Paralympic success, challenging audiences to appreciate their sports as legitimate athletic endeavors rather than inspirational stories. As the formal portion of the reception concluded, Catherine addressed the gathering, speaking without notes about what she had learned throughout the afternoon. Her remarks reflected genuine understanding of the complex challenges these women had faced and the systemic changes still needed to achieve true equality in sport. Today has illuminated not just individual achievements, but the collective transformation that occurs when barriers are removed and potential is unleashed, the princess observed. Each of your stories demonstrates that investing in women's sport isn't just about fairness, it's about maximizing human potential and strengthening our entire society. Her words resonated with the assembled women, who had spent their careers making similar arguments to skeptical administrators, reluctant sponsors, and indifferent media outlets. Hearing these concepts articulated by someone with the princess's platform and influence felt like validation for their lifelong advocacy efforts. The evening concluded with informal conversations that continued long past the scheduled end time. These women, who had often felt isolated in their respective sports and roles, found connection and support in shared experiences of challenging established norms and creating opportunities for future generations. The morning after the reception, Catherine found herself reviewing notes she had taken throughout the previous day's conversations. What had started as a formal celebration had evolved into something far more significant, a gathering that revealed both the magnitude of progress made and the scope of work still required to achieve genuine equality in sport. The stories she had heard demanded action, not just acknowledgement. Her private secretary, Margaret Thompson, entered the study with a folder containing media coverage of the reception. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, but Catherine noticed that most articles focused on the ceremonial aspects rather than the substantial issues discussed. The pattern was familiar from her previous experience with women's sport coverage: attention to personalities and pageantry rather than performance and policy implications. The coverage misses the real story, Catherine observed, setting aside newspaper clippings. These women shared insights that could transform sport, but the media focused on dress choices and photo opportunities. We need to find ways to amplify their actual messages. Margaret nodded, having witnessed the princess's growing frustration with superficial treatment of serious topics. Over the past year, Catherine had become increasingly strategic about using her platform to advance substantive issues rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. The reception had crystallized her understanding that royal influence could be leveraged to accelerate progress on systemic problems. The princess's phone rang with a call from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been contacted by several sports organizations requesting information about implementing her training protocols. The reception had introduced Elena to decision-makers who had previously been unaware of her research, creating immediate opportunities to expand her influence within the sports science community. Yesterday opened doors that had been closed for years, Elena explained during their conversation. The credibility that comes from royal endorsement has suddenly made my work relevant to people who had dismissed it as niche research. We have a real opportunity to institutionalize these approaches across multiple sports. Catherine recognized the multiplying effect that her support could have on these women's work. Elena's research had been scientifically sound for years, but lacked the institutional backing necessary for widespread implementation. The royal platform could provide credibility that accelerated adoption of proven methods, potentially benefiting thousands of female athletes currently training under suboptimal protocols. Later that morning, Sarah Mitchell called to discuss an unexpected development in her rugby career. Several major sponsors had reached out following media coverage of the reception, interested in supporting women's rugby programs that had previously struggled for funding. The visibility generated by royal attention had translated directly into financial resources for sport development. Companies that had never returned our calls are now requesting meetings, Sarah explained enthusiastically. They're finally recognizing that women's rugby has commercial potential, not just as a charitable cause but as a legitimate marketing opportunity. This could change everything for the next generation of players. The princess understood that sustainable progress required economic viability rather than charitable sympathy. Companies supporting women's sport because they recognized its value and potential represented a fundamental shift from previous approaches that treated female athletics as corporate social responsibility rather than strategic investment. Catherine's calendar filled rapidly with requests for meetings from sports organizations, government officials, and private sector leaders who wanted to capitalize on momentum generated by the reception. The challenge became directing this energy toward meaningful reform rather than allowing it to dissipate in symbolic gestures or short-term publicity campaigns. Dr. Amara Okafor sent a detailed proposal for establishing a comprehensive mental health support network for female athletes at all levels. Her research had revealed significant gaps in psychological services tailored to women's specific needs in sport, and she had developed evidence-based programs to address these deficiencies. The royal endorsement had attracted potential funders who could make these programs widely available. Mental health support has been the missing piece in women's sport development, Amara explained during a video conference with Catherine. We've focused on physical training and technical skills, but ignored the psychological dimensions that often determine whether talented athletes continue or abandon their careers. Proper support systems could dramatically increase retention and performance. The princess reviewed Amara's detailed research, recognizing patterns that extended beyond sport into broader social issues affecting women's confidence and leadership development. Supporting female athletes' mental health could serve as a model for addressing similar challenges in education, business, and other fields where women faced systematic discouragement. Jennifer Chang contacted Catherine about establishing a fellowship program that would place former female athletes in sports administration roles throughout the industry. Jennifer had observed that decision-making positions in sport remained heavily male-dominated, perpetuating policies and practices that disadvantaged women. Systematic placement of women with athletic experience in leadership roles could accelerate institutional change. We need to stop asking permission and start taking seats at the table, Jennifer argued compellingly. These fellowship positions would give qualified women the experience and connections necessary to advance into permanent leadership roles. Within a decade, we could have female voices influencing every major decision in sports administration. The fellowship concept appealed to Catherine because it addressed systemic problems rather than individual grievances. Placing numerous women in influential positions simultaneously would create networks of support and shared advocacy that could withstand resistance to change. The program would also provide concrete career pathways for athletes transitioning from competition to administration. Maria Santos proposed an ambitious expansion of Paralympic sport access, particularly for women in developing countries where disability often intersected with poverty and gender discrimination to create insurmountable barriers to athletic participation. Her foundation had identified talented athletes worldwide who lacked basic equipment and training opportunities, despite having potential for international competition. Disability and gender create compounding disadvantages in many cultures, Maria explained during a meeting at Kensington Palace. Women with disabilities are often hidden from public view, never mind encouraged to pursue athletics. We have an opportunity to change lives while developing an enormous pool of untapped athletic talent. Maria's international perspective reminded Catherine that sport could serve as a vehicle for broader social change, particularly in societies where women's participation in public life remained restricted. Supporting female Paralympic athletes could challenge assumptions about capability and visibility while creating positive role models for other women with disabilities. The princess began developing a comprehensive strategy that would coordinate these various initiatives under a unified framework for advancing women's sport. Rather than supporting isolated projects, she envisioned an interconnected system that addressed barriers at every level from youth development through professional competition and post-career leadership opportunities. Her approach reflected lessons learned from successful social change movements that had combined individual support with systemic reform. The strategy would include immediate assistance for current athletes while building infrastructure for long-term transformation of sports culture and institutions. Government officials reached out to discuss potential policy implications of the princess's advocacy. Ministers recognized that royal support for women's sport could translate into public pressure for increased funding and regulatory changes that leveled playing fields across multiple sports. The political dimensions added complexity but also opportunity for large-scale impact. Catherine met with education ministers to discuss integrating improved physical education programs for girls into national curriculum standards. Research had demonstrated that positive early experiences in sport were critical for lifelong participation, yet many schools continued to offer limited or uninspiring athletic opportunities for female students. "We're losing girls from sport at alarming rates during adolescence," Catherine observed during policy discussions. "If we can't keep them engaged through secondary education, we'll never develop the broad base of participation necessary to support elite competition and coaching development." The education component required careful navigation of bureaucratic processes and competing priorities, but offered the potential for the most widespread impact. Changes to physical education standards could affect millions of girls annually, creating a pipeline of confident, skilled athletes and sports leaders for decades to come. Media organizations began requesting exclusive interviews and documentary access, recognizing that the princess's advocacy represented a significant story with ongoing developments. Catherine carefully selected media partners who demonstrated genuine commitment to substantive coverage rather than superficial personality profiles. Her media strategy focused on amplifying the voices and expertise of the women she had met at the reception rather than positioning herself as the central figure. The goal was using royal platform to elevate their messages and create sustained attention for their work and causes. International sporting organizations took notice of developments in Britain, with several requesting meetings to discuss implementing similar programs in their countries. The reception had created a model for using institutional influence to accelerate progress on women's sport that could be adapted to different cultural and political contexts. As news of the various initiatives spread throughout the sporting community, Catherine began receiving messages from athletes around the world sharing their own stories and requesting support for local programs. The response confirmed that the barriers faced by British women in sport were universal problems requiring coordinated international solutions. The princess recognized that the reception had created a moment of unprecedented opportunity that required immediate action to achieve lasting impact. The convergence of royal support, media attention, and financial interest created conditions for advancing women's sport that might not occur again for years. Working late into the evening, Catherine developed detailed timelines and resource requirements for each proposed initiative, understanding that successful advocacy required concrete plans and measurable outcomes rather than inspiring rhetoric. The next phase would test whether the enthusiasm generated by the reception could be translated into institutional changes that would survive shifts in public attention and political priorities. 6 months after the Windsor Castle reception, the landscape of women's sport in Britain had begun to shift in ways that surprised even the most optimistic advocates. The initiatives sparked by that gathering had evolved from ambitious proposals into functioning programs with measurable impacts on athletes, institutions, and public perception. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood in her new research facility at the National Sports Institute, surrounded by cutting-edge equipment that had seemed impossible to obtain just a year earlier. The royal endorsement had attracted funding from sources that had previously shown no interest in sports science research, particularly studies focused exclusively on female athletes. Government grants, private donations, and corporate sponsorships had combined to create a research environment that matched the world's best facilities. "We're now conducting studies that will rewrite textbooks on athletic performance," Elena explained to visiting researchers from universities across Europe. "For the first time, we have the resources to investigate questions that have been ignored for decades because they specifically affected women's athletic potential." Her current research projects included comprehensive studies of menstrual cycle impacts on different types of athletic performance, optimal recovery protocols for female endurance athletes, and nutrition requirements during various training phases. The data emerging from these studies was already influencing training programs for national teams and professional clubs throughout the country. The facility had also become a training ground for the next generation of sports scientists, with fellowship programs specifically designed to increase female representation in research fields that had historically been dominated by men. Young women who might have been discouraged from pursuing careers in sports science now saw clear pathways and role models that made these aspirations realistic. Elena's work had gained international recognition, with sports organizations from around the world requesting collaboration on similar research projects. The British model was being replicated in countries that recognized the competitive advantages of understanding and optimizing female athletic performance rather than simply adapting male-centered approaches. Sarah Mitchell's rugby development program had exceeded all expectations, with participation in women's rugby increasing by over 300% in the 6 months since the reception. The corporate sponsorships that had emerged following royal attention had provided resources for equipment, facility improvements, and coaching education that had previously been unavailable to women's programs. Girls who never would have considered rugby are now showing up to training sessions because they see it as a legitimate sport with real opportunities, Sarah observed while watching a youth practice session at a newly constructed facility in Manchester. Parents are supporting their daughters' participation because they understand that scholarships and professional opportunities actually exist. The transformation had required more than just financial resources. Sarah had worked with schools throughout the country to develop age-appropriate programs that introduced rugby skills in environments where girls felt comfortable learning and making mistakes. The approach emphasized fun and skill development rather than immediate competition, recognizing that many girls had been discouraged from sport by overly competitive early experiences. Professional women's rugby had also benefited from increased attention and investment, with television coverage expanding dramatically and ticket sales reaching levels that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The combination of improved play quality and strategic marketing had created genuine entertainment value that attracted audiences beyond traditional rugby supporters. Jennifer Chang's fellowship program had placed 15 former female athletes in sports administration positions across major organizations throughout Britain. These women were already beginning to influence decision-making processes, bringing perspectives and experiences that had been absent from previous discussions about resource allocation, program development, and policy implementation. Having women in the room when decisions are made has changed the entire conversation, Jennifer explained during a quarterly review meeting with fellowship participants. Issues that were previously invisible are now being addressed because we have people with lived experience of the problems we're trying to solve. The fellows had formed a supportive network that shared information and coordinated advocacy efforts across different sports and organizations. Their collective influence was becoming apparent in policy changes that addressed everything from facility design to marketing strategies for women's competitions. One fellow, former Olympic swimmer Rebecca Foster, had successfully advocated for equal pool time allocation at a major aquatic center that had previously given priority scheduling to men's programs. Her detailed analysis of usage patterns and revenue generation had provided irrefutable evidence that previous allocation decisions were based on assumptions rather than actual data. Another fellow, former tennis player Priya Patel, had convinced her organization to restructure prize money distribution for junior tournaments, eliminating gender-based disparities that had been discouraging girls from continuing competitive play. The changes had immediate effects on participation rates and retention through teenage years. Dr. Amara Okafor's mental health support network had become a model for sports psychology services worldwide. The program provided specialized counseling, peer support groups, and educational resources that addressed the unique challenges faced by female athletes at all levels of competition. Early results demonstrated significant improvements in both performance and personal well-being among participants. Female athletes have different psychological needs than their male counterparts, and our services reflect that understanding, Amara explained to a conference of international sports psychologists. We address issues like body image, role conflict, and imposter syndrome that specifically affect women's ability to perform at their highest levels. The network had also developed innovative programs for coaches and support staff, helping them recognize and respond appropriately to mental health issues that might otherwise go unaddressed. Training modules covered everything from eating disorder warning signs to effective communication strategies for building confidence rather than undermining it. Research conducted through the network was revealing important insights about the relationship between societal gender expectations and athletic performance. Studies showed that female athletes who received support in developing strong personal identities beyond their sport were more resilient and had longer, more successful careers than those who defined themselves exclusively through athletic achievement. Maria Santos's International Development Program had established training centers in 12 countries, providing equipment and coaching for women with disabilities who had previously been excluded from athletic opportunities. The program had already identified potential Paralympic athletes who would be competing for their countries within the next Olympic cycle. We're discovering extraordinary talent in places where women with disabilities had been written off as incapable of achievement, Maria reported during a video conference with international Paralympic committees. These athletes aren't just changing their own lives, they're transforming perceptions about disability and gender in their communities. The program had also established partnerships with local organizations in each country, ensuring that support for female Paralympic athletes would continue beyond the initial intervention period. Local coaches were being trained in adaptive techniques, equipment was being manufactured regionally to reduce costs, and competition opportunities were being developed to provide pathways from recreational participation to elite performance. One particularly successful example was in Kenya, where a partnership with a local disability organization had led to the discovery of several world-class potential athletes in track and field events. These women had been supporting themselves through subsistence farming while managing significant disabilities, but their natural athletic abilities became apparent once they gained access to proper training and equipment. Catherine's coordination of these various initiatives had required careful attention to maintaining momentum while ensuring sustainable development. The initial enthusiasm generated by royal attention needed to be channeled into institutional changes that would survive shifts in public interest and political priorities. Her strategy had involved building broad coalitions of support that included government officials, private sector leaders, and international organizations. By distributing ownership of the various programs across multiple institutions, Catherine ensured that no single entity could discontinue the work even if priorities changed within individual organizations. The princess had also established measurement systems that tracked concrete outcomes rather than just participation numbers or media coverage. Regular assessments of athlete performance improvements, career advancement for program participants, and policy changes implemented by partner organizations provided evidence of real impact that justified continued investment. Educational components of the overall strategy were showing particular promise, with new physical education curricula being implemented in schools throughout the country. These programs emphasized skill development and personal achievement rather than competitive comparison, creating more positive early experiences for girls in sport. Teachers were receiving specialized training in gender-inclusive coaching methods, and equipment was being provided that accommodated different body types and developmental stages. Early feedback from schools indicated that girls were remaining engaged in physical education at higher rates than previous cohorts. The international impact of Britain's initiative was becoming apparent as other countries began implementing similar programs. The European Union had announced funding for women's sport development projects based explicitly on the British model, and several Commonwealth countries were developing their own versions of the fellowship and research programs. Sports equipment manufacturers had responded to increased demand by developing products specifically designed for female athletes, rather than simply producing smaller versions of men's equipment. Research from Elena's facility had informed these design improvements, creating gear that enhanced rather than hindered women's performance. Media coverage of women's sport had expanded beyond the initial surge of attention following the reception, with several broadcasters making long-term commitments to comprehensive coverage. Advertising revenue was beginning to approach levels that made women's competitions financially viable for media companies, creating sustainable models for continued growth. The cumulative effect of these changes was becoming apparent in participation statistics, performance improvements, and cultural shifts that extended beyond sport into broader discussions about gender equality and opportunity. The reception at Windsor Castle had catalyzed a transformation that was reshaping expectations and possibilities for women throughout British society. 2 years after the Windsor Castle reception, Catherine stood once again in the same hall where it had all begun, but this time the gathering represented something far more significant than celebration. The room was filled with representatives from 30 countries who had traveled to Britain to learn about implementing similar programs in their own nations. What had started as a single afternoon supporting women's sport had evolved into a global movement that was transforming athletics worldwide. The statistics displayed on screens throughout the hall told a remarkable story of progress. Female participation in sport across Britain had increased by 180% over 2 years, with the most dramatic growth occurring among teenage girls who had historically dropped out of athletics during secondary education. More importantly, retention rates had improved significantly, with young women continuing their athletic involvement through university and beyond. Dr. Elena Rodriguez addressed the international delegates, sharing research findings that had revolutionized training protocols for female athletes around the world. Her facility had become the premier destination for sports science education, attracting researchers and coaches who returned to their countries with evidence-based approaches to optimizing women's athletic performance. We've proven beyond question that understanding physiological differences leads to superior performance rather than explaining away limitations, Elena reported to the assembled international audience. Countries that have implemented our protocols are seeing dramatic improvements in their female athletes' results at international competitions. The data supported Elena's assertions convincingly. Nations that had adopted her research-based training methods had seen their female athletes achieve medal counts that exceeded previous performances by substantial margins. The competitive advantages of understanding and accommodating gender differences in athletic preparation had become impossible to ignore. Elena's influence had extended beyond immediate performance improvements to reshape sports science education globally. Universities throughout Europe and North America had revised their curricula to include mandatory coursework on gender-specific training methods, ensuring that future coaches and sports scientists would be equipped with comprehensive knowledge rather than male-centered assumptions. Sarah Mitchell had used her platform as a successful program developer to establish the Global Women's Rugby Foundation, which was introducing the sport to countries where female athletics had been culturally discouraged or prohibited. The foundation's approach combined athletic development with advocacy for women's broader participation in public life, using sport as a vehicle for social change. Rugby teaches women that they can be physical, competitive, and demanding of respect, Sarah explained to delegates from countries where these concepts challenged traditional gender roles. The lessons learned on the field translate directly into confidence in boardrooms, political arenas, and family relationships. The foundation had achieved remarkable success in unexpected locations. In several Middle Eastern countries, women's rugby programs had gained acceptance by emphasizing the sports values of teamwork, discipline, and strategic thinking while providing culturally appropriate training environments. These programs had created opportunities for women to develop leadership skills and physical confidence that extended far beyond athletic competition. Sarah's work had also influenced international rugby governance, with the World Rugby Organization implementing new policies to ensure equal resource allocation and promotional support for women's competitions. The changes had accelerated the sport's global growth and elevated the profile of female players who had previously struggled for recognition. Jennifer Chang's fellowship program had expanded to include partnerships with sports organizations on every continent, systematically placing women in decision-making positions throughout the global athletics community. The program had created a network of influential advocates who were coordinating efforts to address systemic barriers that had limited women's opportunities in sport. We now have women in leadership positions who can open doors that had been closed for decades, Jennifer reported during a panel discussion with international federations. The collective impact of these placements is reshaping policies, funding priorities, and cultural attitudes toward women's sport at the highest levels of international competition. The fellowship alumni had achieved remarkable success in advancing women's athletics within their respective organizations. Former fellows now held positions as Olympic team managers, international federation board members, and professional league executives. Their influence was apparent in policy changes that had improved everything from anti-harassment protocols to facility design standards. One fellow, former basketball player Lindsey Thompson, had convinced the International Basketball Federation to restructure its youth development programs to address the dramatic decline in female participation during teenage years. Her research had identified specific policy changes that could retain girls in basketball through adolescence, recommendations that were now being implemented globally. Another alumni, former track athlete Carmen Rodriguez, had successfully lobbied for changes to international anti-doping procedures that had previously failed to account for women's hormonal cycles when interpreting test results. Her advocacy had prevented several false positive cases that could have destroyed innocent athletes' careers. Dr. Amara Okafor's mental health support network had become the standard model for sports psychology services internationally, with organizations throughout the world implementing similar programs adapted to their cultural contexts. The approach had demonstrated that addressing female athletes' psychological needs improved both performance and personal well-being in measurable ways. Mental health support is no longer viewed as a luxury or weakness indicator, Amara explained to mental health professionals from around the world. We've proven that psychological support is as essential as physical training for achieving optimal athletic performance, particularly for female athletes who face unique societal pressures. The network's research had contributed to significant advances in understanding the relationship between gender socialization and athletic performance. Studies had revealed how cultural messages about femininity and competitiveness could limit women's ability to perform at their highest levels, leading to targeted interventions that help athletes overcome these psychological barriers. International adoption of Amara's methods had created a global community of sports psychologists specializing in women's mental health needs. This network was sharing research and best practices that continued to refine and improve support services for female athletes at all levels of competition. Maria Santos's International Paralympic program had achieved perhaps the most dramatic results, with several athletes discovered through her centers already winning medals at international competitions. More significantly, the program had changed attitudes toward disability and gender in communities throughout the developing world. "We're not just creating athletes, we're challenging fundamental assumptions about human potential," Maria reported to Paralympic officials from around the world. "Women with disabilities are proving that they can achieve excellence in ways that transform entire societies' understanding of capability and worth." The program had established training centers in 35 countries, with local organizations now operating independently to continue developing female Paralympic talent. The sustainable model ensured that initial investments would continue generating benefits for decades as local coaches and administrators maintained and expanded the programs. One of the most compelling success stories had emerged from Bangladesh, where a young woman named Rashida Khan had progressed from subsistence farming to Paralympic medal contention in just 18 months. Rashida's success had inspired hundreds of other women with disabilities to pursue athletic opportunities that had previously been unimaginable in their cultural context. Catherine's role had evolved from initial catalyst to strategic coordinator of an international movement that was advancing women's sport on multiple continents simultaneously. Her approach had demonstrated how institutional influence could be leveraged to create systematic change rather than merely symbolic support. The princess had established formal partnerships with organizations including the United Nations, International Olympic Committee, and Commonwealth Games Federation to embed support for women's sport development into their ongoing programs. These partnerships ensured that advocacy efforts would continue regardless of changes in political leadership or public attention. Her influence had also extended to the private sector, with major corporations now viewing investment in women's sport as strategically important rather than philanthropically motivated. Research had demonstrated that companies supporting women's athletics experienced measurable benefits in employee engagement, brand perception, and market access. Educational impacts of the initiative were becoming apparent as universities reported increased enrollment of young women in sports-related academic programs. The visibility of successful female sports scientists, administrators, and coaches had created career aspirations that had previously been absent among female students. Physical education programs in schools throughout the Commonwealth had been transformed based on research and best practices developed through the British initiative. These changes were producing measurable improvements in girls' fitness levels, confidence, and continued participation in athletics through adolescence and young adulthood. The technology sector had responded to increased demand for women's sports content by developing new platforms and applications specifically designed to serve this growing market. Investment in women's sports media had reached levels that created sustainable business models for comprehensive coverage and analysis. International sporting events were reflecting the increased depth and quality of women's competition, with several sports reporting higher television ratings for women's events than comparable men's competitions. This reversal of traditional patterns had accelerated sponsor interest and media investment in women's athletics. As Catherine concluded her remarks to the international delegates, she reflected on how far the movement had progressed since that initial afternoon at Windsor Castle. The reception had brought together remarkable women whose individual achievements had already been extraordinary, but their collective impact had exceeded even the most optimistic projections. 2 years ago, we gathered to celebrate individual excellence, Catherine observed. Today, we're coordinating a global effort that will create opportunities for millions of girls and women who haven't even been born yet. This is how lasting change happens, not through single events or individual achievements, but through systematic efforts that transform institutions and cultural expectations. the delegates left Britain with detailed implementation plans for their own countries, supported by funding commitments from international organizations and technical assistance from the programs that had proven successful in the British context. The movement that had begun in one afternoon was now positioned to continue expanding independently, sustained by evidence of success and supported by growing recognition of its value. As the hall emptied and Catherine prepared to leave Windsor Castle once again, she understood that the reception 2 years earlier had been just the beginning of something far larger than anyone had imagined. The legacy would be measured not in ceremony or recognition, but in the transformed lives of countless women who would pursue athletic excellence in a world that finally recognized their potential and supported their ambitions.